I'm Philip Booth, Editorial and Programme Director at the Institute of Economic Affairs. We're continually being told by people like François Hollande and members of the naive Keynesian School of Economics that we have a choice between growth and austerity. But the first question we should ask is, austerity? What austerity? Britain had a huge spending boom in the early 21st century. Government spending was uncontrolled. The government is now beginning to try to reverse some of that growth in government spending. Up to now, however, there's been no reversal of this trend. Analysis by Tulip-Prebon has shown that public spending has been rising in cash terms and has been more or less stagnant in real terms under the current government, and it will remain so next year. Veronique de Rugy has shown that this picture is pretty much repeated across the European Union. What has happened, though, is that taxes have been hugely increased to pay for the reckless spending of earlier years. This is exactly what government should not do. After a spending splurge, you should cut back spending and not increase taxes. Increasing taxes damages the economy, not for the Keynesian reasons often cited, but by raising business costs, damaging incentives, reducing entrepreneurship, and so on. The evidence suggests that trying to get out of a recession just by increasing borrowing will not work. Japan has been trying that for 20 years and it's ended up with government debt over 200% of national income, and growth has been very sluggish. The Keynesians say that they simply haven't borrowed enough, but how much is enough? The problem is that if you increase government borrowing, it tends to raise interest rates, raise the exchange rate, and then just round the corner are the tax increases that are necessary to service the debt that's been built up. And all of these things reduce economic activity. And it's for these reasons that the evidence suggests that in fact the Keynesian multiplier is more or less zero in developed economies with high levels of national debt on floating exchange rates. And in the rest of the European Union, particularly in the Eurozone, there's an additional problem. All the debt that is going to be floated in order to finance government borrowing will just impair the creditworthiness of existing debt because these countries are already so indebted. And if that happens, that will damage the banking system yet further, and it's actually the problems within the banking system that are one of the main obstacles to growth. Very often comparisons are made by Keynesians to the 1930s. They tell us that if we don't do something to increase government borrowing and increase growth, we'll end up like we were in the 1930s. Some of these Keynesians should study the 1930s a bit more closely. 8 years after the start of the Great Depression, output had recovered to such a level that it was as if the Great Depression had never happened in the United Kingdom. There is no chance whatsoever of a similar thing happening by 2016 in the so-called Great Recession. If Keynesian policies had led to the 1930s recovery, Paul Krugman and his Keynesian friends might have a case. But throughout the 1930s, government borrowing was never much more than 1% of national income until output had recovered. Fiscal prudence was stunningly effective compared with today's fiscal recklessness. It is true that the situation is not the same today. The headwinds are perhaps more difficult. We have a banking crisis, we have a government which is piling on more regulatory burdens onto business, and we have the Eurozone crisis. But just because life is more difficult today is not a reason to impose policies which are destined to fail. So let's sum up. There are four policy options. Firstly, reduce the deficit by increasing taxation. Secondly, reduce the deficit by reducing government spending. Thirdly, increase the deficit by decreasing taxes to try to promote growth. Fourthly, increase the deficit by increasing government spending to try to promote growth. So far the government has chosen the first policy over the second, and that was a big mistake. But to compound that error by increasing government spending would be a disaster. There will be little, if any, short-term economic growth, and everybody would know that growth-destroying tax increases were just around the corner. What the government actually needs to do is to get a grip on government spending and reverse the increase in the size of the state that took place in the early 21st century.